Hello, chess family. It's me, National Master Jesse James, and today we're taking a look at game number 8 from my 60 Most Memorable Games by Bobby Fischer, of course. Here we're going to see Fischer versus Keres in a game called Meat and Potatoes. I love this game. It really is a game of meat and potatoes. You're trying to get to the core. You want what's really good for you, and this is a very nice game. We get to see a Ruy Lopez, over 500 years old. Definitely one of the hardest openings that e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 gets to give you. And the game just goes on for the whole time. Fischer gets a good advantage in the opening, changes it over to the middle game for another good advantage, and then it goes into a very interesting end game with a 2-pawn extra. Well, you would think 2 pawns extra in a bishop endgame would be pretty simple, but it actually was not. So let's go ahead and get started with this game. It's going to be a biggie. Here we go. Fischer's playing with white, and again, Keres with black. We start with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, Ruy Lopez, as I had said. Pawn a6, Morphy's defense. Bishop a4, knight f6, castles, main line. Bishop e7, rook e1. Pawn b5 to attack the bishop. Bishop back to b3. Castles and pawn c3 here. Just remember, guys, whenever you are playing with the Ruy Lopez, you're trying to get the pawn to d4. I will know if you're not a real Ruy Lopez player because you play your knight to c3. Although it looks regular, you lose your advantage. Remember, you want to play c3, d4 to get 2 pawns in the center. What's better than 1 pawn in the center? 2 pawns. So c3 gets ready to do that. Here, black plays d6. A nice little tricky move here. d6 is going to help prepare to play c5, at least at this time, for the Shikoran defense. And also, it comes with this idea of knight a5 to attack the bishop. But we'll be seeing that shortly. Here, d6 also comes with the idea of playing bishop g4 to attack the knight. So we don't want this to happen, so we play pawn to h3. Now knight a5 comes to attack the bishop. Bishop back to c2. Pawn c5. This idea is very good and definitely one of my favorite ones to play whenever you do play the black side of this. Shikoran defense is very, very versatile. It can be played a lot of different ways. You can see that c5 is opening up on the queen side and also trying to stop d4 from happening. With that being said, what does white play? d4 anyways. If you don't play this, well, you won't really get an advantage, and the c5 move is just going to try and open up on the queen side. Remember, when you're playing the Ruy Lopez, you're trying to go ahead and play queen side and open up the center, while white is going to try to close the center and then go for king side attack. Let's see how Fischer does it. So we continue. Right now, the threat is to take on e5. And just for those who don't know this Ruy Lopez too well, you can't just take right away. A lot of the takes will actually give you a bad position. For instance, if you just take, then after knight takes d4, well, you have a backwards pawn and open file here. You're just in a worse position. White definitely can claim the advantage. And in all the games I see here, white is just winning, with black winning very, very few times, at least at master level. All right, back to the game. Here after d4, his opponent Keres, the Estonian grandmaster, goes ahead and plays queen c7. Now this makes sense because we're going to try and play down the c file, so c takes d4 in the future will be good, and it also defends the pawn here on e5. All right, knight b to d2. Pawn takes, again, we're going to try and put pressure down the c-file. I don't think taking right away here is the best, but it is a way to play. Bishop b7 here, always an interesting move, especially in these Shikoran variations, where you place your light square bishop. d7, b7, e6, trying to provoke d5, I don't think is too good. With that being said, bishop b7 got played, and knight f1, we continue with the Steinitz knight maneuver. What happens a lot in these Ruy Lopez is that when you're trying to get your knight into the game, well, you can't go to c3 first because the pawn's usually there. So once the knight goes to d2, then, only then, is it good to take on d4, because then the knight can't go to its best or an optimal square, the knight going to c3. All right, so knight f1 gets played, and as I mentioned before, the Steinitz knight maneuver is stopping the double stacks of the knight here. Well, the knight is in the way of this way, so we go f1, and it can either go to g3 or e3. Most of the time g3, as it's going to be a better square to control the e4 square and also on f5. Maybe even sometimes trading on f5 here. All right, here he comes. Rook c8, getting down this c-file, attacking the bishop. Bishop d3, just moving out the way here. It's definitely the easiest solution for this position. This is a semi-open position, so there's still lots of maneuvering going on. Knight back to c6, and it looks like black's just having a good position here, as after knight to c6 here, you see there's knight b4 threat to try and get the knight to c2 for a penetration square, maybe even trying to win the bishop pair, and even putting pressure on the d4 pawn. Now, here I really like Fischer's move, so I'll go ahead and ask you, what do you play here as white? All right, hopefully you push pause. Remember, these are interactive lessons. If you have a hard time finding this move, pay attention. These are basic Ruy Lopez ideas. Here, if you thought about developing a bishop, not a bad idea, but what happens a lot of time in Ruy Lopez is that we actually don't move this bishop at all, just because it's already placed on a good diagonal here. You already have 1, 2, 3, 4, and possibly 5, 6 pieces ready to do kingside attack. So, well, the rook coming out right away is not really too helpful here. And yeah, so bringing out the bishop even to e3, again, is an okay move, just not the best. Here, again, I said I like what Fischer plays, knight to e3, and you see he's attacking the weak squares of f5 and d5. This is very common in these types of positions. Of course, you can snack on the pawn, but taking the pawn won't help you out too much. For instance, after knight takes on d4, white just holds a good advantage. After knight takes, pawn takes, and knight to f5. Here you see the knight's on its best square. There's good attacking chances now. There's no more penetration on c2, as the bishop is just guarding that. And we could take the d4 pawn probably at our leisure. But here, only white can claim the advantage. Back to the game. Here, after knight c6, knight to e3, the Estonian Grandmaster goes ahead and plays rook to e8, which makes a lot of sense. What this rook e8 move does is try to bring back the bishop so you can go g6 and take away this f5 square. Alright, so here we go. Knight to f5 gets played anyways. Bishop back to f8. Again, we don't want to lose this dark square bishop as it's one of the good defenders for the king. Bishop g5, now developing with a threat, because now we're threatening to take here on f6, giving double pawns. So here, it is pretty interesting that Fischer does decide to bring the bishop out. At this point, the kingside attack is not certain enough, so we might as well start bringing our other rook into the game and making an attack down the c-file. Alright, back to the game. Knight went to d7 here, of course not allowing this doubling of the pawns. Rook c1 now. The game's going on long enough that we can actually bring our rook into the game. Queen back to b8. And bishop back to b1. I always hear people say this is very weird to see the bishop going back to b1, but this makes complete sense. What's the idea of bishop b1? Well, the bishop's going to move out the way, opening up the queen so you can put pressure down the d-file if needed. And also, well, bishop on b1 looks weird because, I mean, isn't bishop on the back row bad? Now, the only reason why this is not bad here is because the rook has been moved out to c1. Now the bishop is completely great here, and its big idea is to go for kingside attack. There was nothing the bishop was really doing over here. And if you really want to go queenside, you could play bishop back to f1, again moving out the way of the rooks, since the rooks have been moved out the way. But remember, this is a Ruy Lopez, and you're playing this from white, so you have to stay consistent here and go for kingside attack, and maybe even open up the center. Queenside is where black has most of their pieces, so you could attack over there, you just won't have very good chances. Alright, here we go. Knight takes d4 gets played, and well, he's ready for the attack. Unfortunately, at this point, this is where a lot of the advantage, at least for the Estonian Grandmasters, just kind of fails. Now his pawn structure is going to get mixed up, and just not too good here. And of course, Fischer plays this correctly. He goes ahead and plays knight takes d4 here. Hopefully, no one here was thinking rook takes on c8 as well. Knight takes f3, and you're down a clean pawn here. And after queen takes f3, I guess we'll just play either rook takes or queen takes. Which one do I like better? I kind of like rook takes. It seems more principled. So I would play rook takes c8 here. And yeah, again, white's doing okay here because of the backwards pawn, but it is going to be hard to get to win your pawn back. Then you're going to have to go for the attack again. Another way to play here would have been playing e takes d4. And, well, e takes d4, rook takes, queen takes d4. And I really like this position as white here. Anyways, back to the game. After rook takes on c1, bishop takes on c1, e takes d4, and here a nice move. Here, Fischer finds a nice way to start the attack. Go ahead and push pause here. I encourage you to see if you can find the nice combination here for Fischer to start the kingside attack. Alright, hopefully you found it. Remember, when you're looking at tactical positions, you should be looking for undefended pieces, and hopefully you spotted it. It's the knight here on d7. And then, whenever you're doing tactics, use your hierarchy and thinking, checks, captures, and threats, and hopefully you found the move. Here, knight to h6 attacking the king. Black has no better move than just to take here. And then we simply go queen g4 check attacking the king and the knight. And here we got our advantage. Black has these ugly double pawns here. Alright, king went to h8. Queen takes on d7. And now a very interesting move and also best move in the position here for black. You have to defend this f7 pawn. How do you do it? Here by playing bishop to d5. Very, very resourceful. The Estonian Grandmaster is definitely one of my favorite players. And, you know, obviously you can't take on d5 because, well, you're just going to be losing in this position. pretty fast here with rook taking on e1 check, and yep, just game over here. So queen f5 gets played with a very nice threat. You can see the bishop makes a lot of sense on this diagonal now, and we're threatening pawn to e5 for game over. Here, forced move here, rook to e5, not only stopping this attack, but even attacking the queen. Fischer has to move his queen back to f3. And now another very cool move in this position, pawn to f5. He is just going at it here and putting as much pressure as possible. Unfortunately for him, he's playing against the mighty Fischer. White to move, what do you play here? It looks like a complicated position because, well, we can't take on f5 so soon because the rook again takes, bishop is taking, queen can't take because the rook. What do you play here? Alright, hopefully you found it. Develop with a threat. Here, again, we're trying to take on d5. We would love to play e5 in some of these variations. Bishop to f4 gets played here, attacking the rook. And it's not so simple just to take on e4 right away as you take on e5 in check. So, in the game, after bishop f4 was played, rook e8 was played here, and then queen to h5. Very nice move again. And here we're seeing there's troubles on what to play here. You can't play the simple move of pawn takes because, well, you just lose your bishop here on d5. And gosh, what do you play here? Can you play bishop takes? It looks like that's the only good move in this position. So bishop takes on e4, and then another nice move here by Fischer. Pawn to f3, just saying, you know what? I'm going to kick this bishop away, and the f5 pawn is going to be weak. Bishop c6, just defending everything. Of course, taking on b1 would just be a mistake. With rook takes on e8, and, well, you're probably going to get checkmated pretty soon now. So, bishop c6 gets played. Rook to c1 here. Nice move. Not making trades here. Remember, whenever you're attacking, it's always a good idea to keep pieces on the board. So, rook c1, bishop to d7, and bishop takes on h6. Fischer has a very good advantage here, although he may be down a pawn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see that these pawns are all just messed up, and sooner or later, probably these two pawns will be falling pretty soon, with this pawn to fall shortly. Plus, you also have to worry about this kingside attack here. h7 pawn looks very, very weak. Another way to play here was bishop takes on f5. And I think it was probably stronger in this position, but after bishop takes, queen takes, again, you just see this terrible pawn structure right here, so Fischer is the only one that can claim the advantage here. Anyways, bishop takes h6 got played, rook to e6 attacking the bishop, and bishop takes, queen takes, and queen to h4. Here again, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. Everything is just weak, everything's hanging. Queen to f6. Here, the Estonian Grandmaster Keres realizes that the only way that he can try to survive this position is actually trading down to an endgame. The position is so bad, that's the only chance out of this. And, well, should we trade here or should we not trade? Well, Fischer's such a good endgame player that there's no reason not to trade here. He's going to be limiting his chances for losses, just in case there's some kind of queen or rook check. And so going into a winning endgame is just going to be easier to win. So, queen takes, rook takes. King to f2, king heads towards the center. You can see that this d4 pawn will be falling pretty soon. Here, another way to play was rook c7 here, attacking the bishop. Here, rook f7 gets played, rook a7, and Fischer still holds the advantage here. In fact, you can even play bishop takes f5 in the future if you want to, as there's a pin right now. And with the a6 falling, d6 will be falling. Again, just another good way to keep playing here. King f2 got played, king to g7, rook c7 now, rook f7, and king e2. Remember Nimcevich's idea, or his quote, passed pawn should be kept under lock and key, meaning we have to make sure that we take care of these passed pawns, because although it may not be good now, it could be good later. Pawn f4 here, rook to a7, king to f6, and rook just takes on a6. So now the pawns are starting to fall in this position. Rook e7 check, king to f2. Yeah, this is interesting. What was wrong with king to d2? Hopefully you find it. Remember, always think about your weaknesses or pawns that are unprotected. It's black to move. And, well, after this, black actually would be better after rook to g7 and the g2 pawn falls. No good way to stop it here. So, of course, Fischer saw this and does not play this. He just goes over to king f2. Again, this pawn, although weak, is being stopped on d3. And, again, we can catch it later. We're already threatening rook takes on d6, so this kind of forces black's hand. Rook to e6, or even king to e5. But looks like he was trying to get a little bit more aggressive here and plays bishop to e6. Now this is just an easily winning position here for Fischer. Well, it's pretty interesting. Why not go king to e5 in this situation? Here we see that rook a7 gets played, and then pawn to d5. And man, these pawns are just not looking any good here. And you can see that you're stuck in a pin. Apparently, Keres wants to play something a little bit more active, but with activity does come with a cost. Bishop e6, rook takes on d6, king e5 here, defending the pawn actively, and you see that the bishop is putting pressure on the a2 pawn, meaning this bishop cannot take on h7 without some risks. Alright, rook c6 gets played, bishop to c6, rook to h6 here, and this rook is just having a great time by attacking all these pawns. Rook to c7 here. It looks like the rook is going to penetrate, but here Fischer keeps everything in line with rook h5 check, king to d6, rook h6 check, king to e5, rook h5 check, king d6. Why is this happening? Well, there's two reasons why. Just remember, back in those days, there was time control to be made, so you were wanting to get some extra time on the clock. You could keep repeating positions. Another reason why this happens is it also lets your opponent know who's in charge here. Here, Keres would be very, very happy just to take the draw. So this is letting his opponent know, hey, I'm in charge here, and yeah, you got to just play along with it for now. And now, of course, Fischer does not repeat for the third time, as threefold repetition would have happened. Rook goes to f5 here, and we're going to be winning this f4 pawn. Rook c1, bishop d3, rook to d1, king e2, rook g1, king f2, rook d1, king e2, rook g5 here. Of course, again, Fischer's letting his opponent know who's in charge and gaining a little time on the clock and trying to get as many moves in as possible. Remember, back in these days, they would have adjournment positions in games if they lasted too long. So, rook g5. The game is actually now astonishingly back to even here. Apparently, Fischer did make a few mistakes here. Bishop takes on a2. Bishop takes on b5. Rook to b1. This b pawn is going to be falling pretty soon. So, king d3, h6, rook h5, rook takes, king takes, rook takes, and rook takes on h6. And this is that interesting endgame that we're going to be getting to. So the f4 pawn will be falling, but it's going to be f3 and h3. And here, well, of course, we'd love to trade off all our pawns, but with the rooks and bishops on the board, this is still a challenge here. Here we go. King e7, king e4, rook g5, bishop to a6. Don't forget, every time your opponent makes a move, ask yourself what's my opponent's threat. So if you took on f4 here, be careful, you just lost your bishop. And bishop back to f7, bishop back to c8, guarding this pawn, and we're going to see that he's going to be pushing this pawn up really nicely here. And rook to g6 here. Do we make the trade or do we not make the trade here? Hopefully you understand this idea. Push pause. Try to see if you understand this position. The rook and bishop endgame. The bishop versus bishop endgame is a little bit trickier than the rook and bishop. So you got to make the trade, but just at the right time. So here, best move is to go ahead and play rook to h7 here. Do not trade off just yet. We're going to trade at the right time. King f8 gets played. Bishop back to g4, rook g7. And because now we're looking at a lot of tempo moves here. Rook h6, rook g6. And now is the time to play it. Rook takes g6 check. Here the tempos work out just perfectly. Bishop takes, king takes. And here you do have to be careful about one certain idea. Alright, notice that the pawns, the pawn structure here. What is black's drawing idea here? It's always good to think about what your opponent wants. So what is black's drawing idea? Alright, hopefully you know your endgames and know that black's drawing idea here is to trade this bishop for this pawn. Wait a second, wouldn't that be bad? Not necessarily. In this one, because the king can get to h8 and this pawn is opposite color of the bishop for the queening square, this actually would be a theoretical draw. So that's the idea that we're fighting against right now. You're going to push your pawn forward, but this king's going to block. And you got to make sure that this bishop does not trade itself for the f3 pawn. Alright, here we go. King g7, king g5. Bishop d3, already ideas about trying to make trades for this pawn will happen. So f4, bishop b4, h4, bishop to d3, h5, bishop back. Again, black has nothing better to do than just kind of wade back and forth. Check, king h8, and you got to be careful here in these kind of positions. King f6 will not be doing anything constructive right now, again, because you got to win this f5 square. So how does Fischer do this? Bishop to f5, kicking the bishop off the diagonal. So here we're going to see this is a very nice technique that Fischer is using. All right, bishop over there, bishop g6, bishop to f5. Again, if you play f5 here, it's simply just a draw after bishop takes here. Oh gosh, how sad would that be? So, back to the game. King f6 now. Bishop to c4. Do we push the pawn now? Hopefully you didn't push the pawn, because after f5, again, you see bishop d3, and the draw happens again. Okay. Let's do this correctly. So, king g5, bishop e6, bishop h5, king to h7 here. Again, you got to be careful. Now bishop g4 would not be the best here, as you can trade, and then king can take on h6. And I believe that should be an easily king and pawn endgame, just because we, again, control the queening square. We got to make sure we're on tempo for it, though. Bishop g4. Oh, apparently this was a good move, because if bishop takes, king takes, king takes, let's see, is it on tempo? It is. It doesn't matter what black plays here, we can just jump on it. For instance, if in this position there's one way to win, king f5, and black cannot jump on the opposition here. King g7, king to e6, and if king g8, we simply just go king e7, winning all the queening squares. And of course, if king goes to f8 here, what do you play here? Hopefully you know your endgames. Here you just play king f6 for the perfect technique here. King g8, king e7, and of course if king goes to e8, then king goes to g7 here, winning all the queening squares again. Alright, back to the game. After bishop c4 was played, pawn to f5, bishop to f7, bishop to h5, bishop to c4 again, bishop g6 check, a nice move here, kicking back the king to its corner, king to g8, f6, and now see if you can find the final idea. At this point, his opponent did resign, but what is the final idea here to win this game? Alright, hopefully you found it. The idea here is to simply walk your king across all the way over to e7, and this idea just cannot be stopped. It doesn't matter if you try to trade off the bishops. You can either make sure that this works by trading, or you can just move your bishop away. The main idea is you can't push the pawns forward just too fast here, or else you will get into drawn situations. Alright, just walk the king around. Bishop b3, king f4, king h8, king e5, bishop c4, king d6, bishop e3, king e7, bishop c4. Do we push the pawn? Of course not. Again, that's going to be the draw. We have to win the f7 square, so what do you play? Hopefully you learned this idea now. Bishop f7, bishop to d3, bishop e8, stopping the bishop from going to g6. Of course, bishop c4 would get played again. Bishop d7, tempo's lost. Bishop g8, bishop e6. For instance, if black tried to play something like bishop g6, of course now we can just play f7 here. And if they try to stay on the diagonal by playing something like bishop b3, now we go bishop e6, and if the bishop goes to f7, there's no more tempo, so again we play f7 there. So, bishop g8, last try here, bishop to e6, bishop h7, and of course we just push here, and it's game over. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed this game. Again, this was the meat and potatoes. This is a very good game. You know, the opening was very interesting. The middle game was very hard, but Fischer does get an advantage. He gets all the way to this end game that still takes a good amount of technique to win. Well guys, hope you enjoyed that. We'll see you in the next one.